I hope that you all enjoyed your lunch, and I'm happy that you stayed with us. And we opened our seminar with the important topic of policy making regarding early childhood education and book reading. And now the first session of the afternoon will take us deeper into the potential of book reading for promoting children's development, starting in infancy, and acknowledging children's varied cultural backgrounds. Rather than focusing solely on literacy and cognitive processes, our session will shed light also on socio-emotional processes. Before I invite our first speaker, I want to remind our beloved friends, some of us mentor, and great early literacy researcher, a woman that dedicated a lot of her life into studying early literacy in Israel within the Jewish and the Arab population, Professor Iris Levin. I'm sure that a lot of you thought about her during the first session. She actually was the one who headed the committee that wrote the curriculum for early literacy, for the basic of early literacy. And I'm sure that she's in her spirit is here with us. And now it is really very easy for me to invite, I'm honored, like many of our researchers, guests are friends of Iris, so they also know her and appreciate her research and her work. So I'm very pleased to invite Professor William Teale, who will present, whose presentation is, and we change a little bit the order, okay? So he's going to be the first presenter. His presentation is entitled Parents and Teachers Reading with Preschoolers, the What's and How's Indicated by Research and Practice. Professor Teale is Professor of Education and the Director of the Center for Literacy in the University of Illinois at Chicago. His work has focused on early literacy learning, the intersection of technology and literacy education and childhood and children's and young adults literature. From 2009, he was principal investigator for 3 early reading programs of Head Start. He had numerous projects that provide Head Start families with services that facilitate children's early development. He has served as a consultant to school districts across the United States, public libraries, and public television stations. He was indicated into the Reading Hall. I don't know if you all know that, but there is a Reading Hall of Fame in 2003. Both of them are. I'm going to present each of them. I'm going to give the credit for each of them separately. So you earn this with really a lot of work. So he was introduced into the Reading Hall of Fame in 2003 and served on the board of directors for the International Reading Association from 2011. So please welcome Professor Bill Teale.
It works. Well, good afternoon. This morning at 10 o'clock, I had probably 6 or 7 points that I wanted to make to you. I think I have 1 or 2 left after the discussion this morning that covered many of these. As Dorit said, I want to focus mainly today on the what's and how's related to reading aloud, and kind of I'm thinking about this talk as a sort of examining the landscape. There's a lot of issues that I'd like to raise about these two things, but if I'm going to talk about those two things, I also want to mention the whys of reading aloud, as well as a little bit about who, and when one talks about who, I think in some senses we'll talk about where as well. And of course, the whole focus of this seminar is on preschool children from disadvantaged communities. Much of what I say today will focus on that, but it will also focus more broadly. So if we think about the landscape of reading aloud, one area of that whole landscape I think of is the issue of reading promotion, which we talked about quite a bit this morning in our discussion. And usually under reading promotion, there are two things that are kind of focused on. One is children's habits, and the other is children's attitudes. In other words, most reading promotion programs tend to stress those kinds of things. And you'll notice that I have Reach Out and Read up there. And a number of other programs related to BookStart and things like that from various countries. And as we kind of think about those programs, I also want to talk about kind of another emphasis. Now, I'm going to have three of these all together, and they overlap with each other, but they're distinct from each other in some senses too. And that is, if reading promotion programs tend to mainly focus on children's habits and attitudes and trying to get kids into a reading mindset and all of that, and trying to get parents aware of the importance of books and literacy in their homes and all of that, then there's another aspect of reading aloud programs that tends to stress more the issue of we're going to use reading aloud as a way of fostering children's early literacy skills. I mean, literally at the skill level and that sort of thing. And then the third piece of this would be kind of an increasing emphasis these days, I think, on some programs that are focusing more specifically on social development. So all of these areas do all of this, I guess is what I want to say, but there are different emphases in different programs, and all of that kind of, in some senses, summarizes the whys of reading aloud programs. In other words, those are the various things that are stressed in reading aloud programs. Just a mention of sort of the who and where. By this I mean, again, some programs tend to focus on families and the home setting. In other words, getting parents to read to their kids, helping parents understand how to read more effectively, that sort of thing. And then there's a whole other area of work that tends to focus on classroom settings, the issue of getting teachers to read aloud to kids and all of that sort of thing. Again, some programs will focus on both of these, but many programs tend to emphasize one versus the other. All right, so that kind of gets us a little bit into the general idea of the whys and the who's and the wheres and all of that. And so mainly I want to focus on the issue of the what's and how's. And one of the things I think that gets this, I guess I would say it gets discussed somewhat, but it also tends to be one of those areas I think about reading aloud programs that is underemphasized, and that is what's being read to kids. So if you've got a program that's doing a lot of work in the homes, what kinds of books are being introduced there? And there hasn't been a lot of research on that, except for certain researchers who are doing things. Or even to some degree, I think the same thing in classrooms. If we're talking about promoting reading aloud in preschools or even in later grades, the issue of what you read. So one issue for me under this is the whole issue of what genre of books might we be looking at that are being read aloud. For preschool kids, sometimes it's alphabet books, right? And also, I would say probably mainly what gets stressed is the issue of using narrative books, right? And under narrative books, we can think of things that are kind of realistic fiction set in the present day. We can think about folk literature, so all of those folk stories that get handed down, traditional stories, all of that, which gets quite a bit of play. Historical fiction, not so much with preschool kids, but a little bit. Usually when people use historical fiction, they're using it with older children than preschool kids. But there are some stories that are kind of historical fiction that could be appropriate for preschool children. One of the things that hasn't been mentioned so far today is poetry. And I kind of want to give a little emphasis on poetry because that can be a very important aspect of language and read-alouds for young children. Susan, in her talk, talked about informational books you mentioned specifically, which I've got up here. And it's like problematic to define something as what it's not. So non-narrative, it's not narrative, it's something else, which is like non-fiction. How do you define something by what it's not, which is, I find, very problematic. So I use the idea of informational books rather than non-fiction books because I think that's important. But then there was this other category of concept books, right? Those are those very simple books that usually may have only one word or one phrase or one sentence on a page. And again, those can be very important types of books to do read-alouds with young children, because in some senses, I think of concept books as the precursors to informational books. We mentioned, and I'm sure many people are going to talk about the whole issue of when one reads aloud, what you see in the text and what you hear from the text is extremely important, but it's the language and social interaction that surround the text that are even perhaps more important than what's in the text when it comes to the impact of reading alouds. And if you look at the conversations that occur around concept books, they're different from the conversations that occur around stories and narratives. And so that's why I think that kind of book is especially important to emphasize in terms of thinking about the different genres of books that are up there. I've never seen a study of this, but I suspect one exists somewhere. If you could look at all of the read-alouds that are done with all of the preschool children in the entire planet. No, that study hasn't been done, has it? But probably you'd see the vast majority of what's read aloud to kids are narrative text. Yes. And the vast majority of narratives are probably realistic fiction and folk literature. Or, well, I guess realistic fiction in the terms of, can you have a rabbit that talks? Well, not really. I guess that's fantasy, but they're all about normal sort of everyday kid activities and that sort of thing. So that's the whole issue of genre, and I think it's a topic that's really important for us to think about in terms of what are we recommending that people read aloud? What are people reading aloud, such as the research that Dorit is doing that looks at parents' choices and where do people get their books and what are their books and how many of them are mass media connected, like in the United States, Disney books and things like that, versus books that are more trade books, and what's in the homes, not just how many books, but what types of books. I think it's important for us to think about. The other thing I want to mention in terms of the what of reading aloud, though, is the issue of format of children's books. Certainly the most common type of book that we see, and my guess is most of the books that are being given out, I know, through Reach Out and Read, and probably through most other reading promotion programs, would be picture books, right, for preschool kids. But I also want us to think about, see, I thought I had a new point, but of course this was even mentioned this morning, the idea of ebooks, and ebooks becoming and apps. I get, like, what's the difference between an ebook and an app? Well, there probably isn't any difference anymore. There used to be 6 or 7 years ago, but those two things are kind of coming together and merging together at this point. So the idea of sharing ebooks with children, and how is that similar to sharing a print book, and how is it different from sharing a print book? And then the other part, of course, of ebooks is that in virtually every ebook, I mean, if you look at the Cinderella one that's up there, that comes from Nosy Crow, there's always a read to me option, which means that the grown-up doesn't even have to be there anymore for the 4-year-old to listen to the book. And what does that mean for read-alouds? And what does that mean for how the parent would introduce that book or do it the first time or second time? But it also gives children the option of not necessarily having to have the parent there to experience the book once again. And I think that opens up a whole realm of different possibilities for us to think about in terms of what young children's book experiences have been like in the past and what they can be like now. Having said that, of course, as all of you know, there's a huge range in terms of quality and in terms of the way ebooks are produced and what's embedded in them or not embedded in them that is really important for us to think about. Because there are lots of ebooks. In fact, one of the ebooks that won one of the sort of top ratings a couple years ago in the United States was Peter Rabbit. And it's a disaster as a book, as far as I am concerned, because what kids do is, here's this story of Peter Rabbit going along, and then on one page, there are these blackberries that come dropping down on the page that have nothing to do with the story, except for the fact that the word blackberry was in the story. And what the kids do is they push them and they squish them. Well, this is great fun, but it's really stupid. Because, well, yeah, developing your fine motor skills maybe, but having anything to do with reading or having anything to do with narrative or comprehension or understanding is destroyed by that whole thing. So that's another talk. And I have one more format for you to think about. And this is a format that probably you're going to say, huh? Graphic novels. All right? Now, at least in the United States, there are graphic novels being produced for preschool children, right? And again, it's a different reading experience. It's sort of like a picture book, but it's not like a picture book. In other words, it's a very different dynamic to read a graphic novel. And some of you are saying, what's a graphic novel? Comic book. Think comic book, all right? Comic book. No, they're words. Maybe words, maybe not. Some graphic novels are wordless. Some have words in them. All the little speech bubbles? Yeah, comics. Comics. So children love it. And up until now, there haven't been very many comics that were written specifically for preschool. In French? Yes. Many in French. Yeah. So here's a sample of the ones that are being produced. In fact, being produced by Françoise, what's her surname? She's Art Spiegelman's wife, and she's the one who's responsible for producing these graphic novels for preschool children in the United States. So the French influence is very much there. And these have a limited number of words in them, but again, they work on panels, not on illustrations like in a children's picture book. So it's something for us to consider in the mix of different books and what we might read and all of that sort of thing. So, have any of you seen any of these graphic novels? Oh, well, yeah. A couple more things about the what of reading aloud, and this we mentioned this morning, but the whole issue of book quality. Just in any country that publishes children's books, there's everything from the sublime to the ridiculous, right? There's about 5,000 new children's and young adult titles published in the United States every year. I'd say probably about 4,000 of those are sort of, I don't even want to look at them. So quality is, I think, an important thing for us to think about, because if we're running programs or doing research, we need to think about what kinds of books are we putting in kids' hands. There's a real problem, though, with thinking about how do you judge quality, how do you gauge quality, right? One thing is there's a whole industry out there of adults who decide how good a children's book is, right? They're the book reviewers. They're the people who write in the United States for Booklist, for Kirkus Review, for all the different reviewing systems that are out there. But then, and there are books that win awards, right? But there are a lot of books that win awards that kids don't really like very much. So that's the other issue, the issue of child appeal, which books appeal to children. But then also, for instance, the International Reading Association does a program called Children's Choices, where children get to vote on the books they like. And sometimes, when we as grown-ups and teachers look at what children like, we think, ooh, bad, some of the... And so sometimes there's real agreement between what the adults think is high quality and what the children really love, and other times there isn't. So again, I think that's something we have to think about. Yeah. How much? Oh, no problem. And then quality versus popularity, so that's there. So the big issue of what books do parents and teachers choose and why, I think, is an under-researched issue in this area. A lot of people look at visual features. Don't tell me you can't judge a book by looking at its cover, because children do all the time. They pick books by what their covers look like half the time. And then there's the issue of book content. And what do teachers choose to read aloud in their classrooms depends a lot on the content of the book and that sort of thing. So the how of reading aloud, there's been a lot of work done on read aloud style. The issue of intensity of reading aloud that Susan talked about today. How much is enough? How much is not enough? How much is too much? I think is something that's been looked at to a degree, but not very much. That's another area where I think there could be some useful extra work to go on. And then when we talk about reading aloud, we often don't talk about this, but I wanted to mention the whole issue of children's emergent readings. Those are those quote-unquote pretend readings that we hear about. After a kid's been read a book 3 times or 4 times, they often will pick it up and read it by themselves, even though they're not processing the print. And what's interesting is there's a dynamic relationship between reading aloud to children and then children's emergent readings by themselves. And the more we can take advantage of bringing those two things together, I think the better. A lot of studies of teacher read aloud style, a lot of work that David's done, work that I and Miriam Martinez have done, and what we found is there are very distinctive styles that teachers use, that usually a teacher is very consistent in his or her read aloud style. You can go from book to book to book, and they do the same kinds of things. But there's the issue of learning how to read to children, because even though you're consistent, you may be really bad at it. So it would be good if you got good at it. So that's a whole area of looking at, and then there's the issue of the relationship between the style and, for instance, the genre that's being read. Like I said, if you're reading an informational book, you may do things differently than when you're reading a narrative book and that sort of thing. And the research that's been done on the impact of reading aloud in classrooms by teachers is I think what it shows is that there is impact on various dimensions of children's early reading skills, of their comprehension abilities, and those sorts of things. And so we know a fair amount about that, I guess I would say, but I think there's a lot of room for additional research in terms of that area. When it comes to parent read aloud style, I don't think it's as well defined as teacher read aloud style. I don't think it's been studied as much. One of the things we do know that as a child, in other words, if you look at a longitudinal studies of parent read alouds, as a child gets older, goes from 2 years old to 3 years old to 4 years old, parents change in terms of what they do. They usually ratchet up what they're doing if they're really in sync with their child. And definitely when parents read a book the second time or the third time or the fourth time, they do different things with that book than the first time they read it. So that's an important thing for us to keep in mind. And then there's the issue of, if you're talking about parents, if you're reading to one child versus you're reading to 3 children, the dynamics of that is always different too because of the different age levels of the kids. Unless you have triplets, I guess. I don't know. But, and no, I don't want to talk about that. Okay, so the issue of intensity, I think, what do I want to say about this? I guess not a lot because we don't know a lot about this. I don't think it's been studied in terms of how, well, to some degree it's been studied, and one of the things, one study showed that was for older kids, first grade kids, is that you can, as a teacher, you can actually read aloud too much to children. Oh, that's shocked you, didn't it? In other words, if you're spending so much time reading aloud that you're neglecting other parts of the curriculum, it actually has a negative impact on kids rather than a positive impact. But you'd have to be reading a lot to kids, like, you know, some teachers reading 4 times a day to children in first grade. Well, that just doesn't make a lot of sense. And then children, so in terms of children's emergent reading opportunities, this has been studied quite a bit in homes. One of the things we know for sure is that virtually every kid who's read to does emergent readings. That Elizabeth Soulsby's work showed how kids go through different stages of emergent readings, and that's been very useful. I don't think that's been looked at as much in classrooms. In other words, if you give children opportunity to read aloud in classrooms, does that have a significant impact or not? And then in terms of child impact, this is the kind of stuff we talked about this morning. So I'm not going to reiterate that except to say I think that's right. In other words, a lot of reading promotion programs don't talk about much except how many books they distributed and how much people liked it or didn't like it. And we need to do the kinds of evaluation things that we were talking about this morning. And I think, you know, the kinds of things that the projects we were talking about this morning are making much more detailed use of their evaluations. And so I think that's critically important. Okay, I'm going to move through this. Boom. I'm going to do that. Wait. One more thing here. So focusing on child impact with respect to parents and reading aloud. Again, I mean, Janet Buss has done this gigantic and fabulous meta-analysis that showed the impact of reading aloud, and we know that other studies have shown that in families where parents read to their children, that makes a difference in terms of immediate impact on kids. Now, and this is one of the issues that David mentioned this morning, the idea of reading achievement in subsequent years. In other words, if children are read to as preschoolers, does that mean it's going to have a significant impact on their reading achievement when they're 11 years old or 12 years old or 15 years old? We actually don't have a lot of data that shows that that's the case. And the other thing is, Dorit mentioned that, you know, we had done our group had done 7 years worth of studies of the impact of preschool programs on children's early language development and early literacy development. And we were lucky in the sense that in the schools we worked in, and we had comparison groups that we looked at, when those preschool children got to kindergarten, we actually had 3 different groups of kids that we could look at. Kids who went through our program, kids who were in comparison schools, and then kids who came to kindergarten in our schools where we could collect data, but they had not been through our program. So they were in the same classrooms with the kids that we had followed up on, but they hadn't had that kind of early preschool intervention program. And what was interesting about we followed those children through kindergarten, first grade, and into second grade. What was interesting is at the beginning of the kindergarten year, the kids who had been through our early reading first program were significantly higher in terms of a number of dimensions of early language development and early literacy development than either of the other 2 groups. In probably about 3/4 of those classrooms, by the end of kindergarten, there was no significant difference among the 3 groups of children. Now, one way to look at that is to say, oh, the other kids caught up, right? So that there was a kind of a ceiling effect, you see what I mean? And the other kids caught up. But I don't think that was the case because even in kindergarten and on to first grade, we were measuring higher level literacy skills. So it should have been that the kids who came in advantaged, you would think, would stay on that track. But they didn't, and pretty consistently they didn't, only in a couple different situations. And I think what that tells us is it almost, and by the way, virtually all of these kids were from economically disadvantaged homes, right? At least 80% of the kids in every one of our classrooms, and in most of our classrooms, it was closer to 100%. So I think what that says to us is 1 year isn't going to make the difference. You need sustained, good, early literacy and language instruction to keep up those differences. In other words, there's no reason why the kids who come in ahead shouldn't stay ahead, except during the first 2 years that we did this, all the kindergarten teachers said, well, they didn't say this to us, but we heard it, like, oh, this is a disaster. And we thought, why is it a disaster when the kids come in with more skills? Because then they had to change their curriculum. Right? In other words, we used to do this, but they've already learned that. So now they have to do things that are more advanced, and so that's the idea. In other words, you have to line up education across the grade levels. You can't just work at one level. So as we're thinking about preschool intervention, that's great, but don't forget, you better be in contact with the other age levels that come above preschool. And so I have 1 more minute worth of thing I want to show you, and this is,
Me. Blackbird, blackbird, what do you see? I see a red bird looking at me. I see a yellow duck looking at me. Yellow duck, what do you see? I see a teacher looking at me. Teacher looking at me. I see 2 kids looking at me. Finish.
I'm finished.